Hello.
Our story begins midway through the Clone War, with a new squad leaving Kamino inside their starship, the Marauder. Following the Battle of Kamino, an experimental group that Nala Se was working on, called the Bad Batch, was created or finished. These were intentionally defective clones with enhanced abilities. Among their squad was Hunter, the individual who had especially high senses for tracking, Tech, who was their technological expert, Wrecker, who dwarfed the average clone, and Crosshair, who was cold and calculated, especially with a sniper rifle. These clones didn't know the fate that would beset them, but they were being sent out into the galaxy to work alongside another squad of commandos. They weren't going to override their work, more or less just assist them. This was, for the Bad Batch, or Clone Force 99, their first chance to prove their effectiveness in the field. On the way through hyperspace, there were perhaps some varying feelings shared between these brothers. Nervousness? Maybe. But this was their first true operation in the field. They crushed every single competition thrown at them inside the Kaminoan training facilities. Clone Force 99 operated with both ARC and Commando training regiments. Their challenges were typically harder than anything any other clone unit faced. However, they were consistently successful. Now would come the real combat. Once their ship exited from hyperspace, they looked at a disabled Venator. Delta had run a similar op earlier in the year on a boarded acclimator. Trandosians were aiding the Separatists with some combative exercises, but the lizard people didn't necessarily have the manpower or tech to hold off a full-blown invasion of their planet. Instead, they became a constant nuisance on Republic work at Kashyyyk, which was a very important strategic location for fur trade. Hunter stood up inside the Marauder and turned to the boys. He propped up a layout of the Venator. Similar to the Trandosian raid earlier in the war, this ship had lost communication and dropped out of hyperspace at these coordinates. Delta Squad was already working inside the facility, and they were informed of the reinforcements they would be receiving. Hunter told his squad that their first goal was to meet up with Delta and understand what invaded the ship. There was a reason for genuine concern. This wasn't any ordinary Jedi cruiser. While a Jedi Master served on it, his purpose was strategic intelligence. This was an experimental long-range communication interceptor. The Republic built all the extra tech into the ship's mainframe, and kept most of the base of it all the same. The intention was to have a capable warship in case the Separatists found it by accident. Well, their intentions were proven wrong due to the lack of communication from the ship and the fact that something had happened. The Venator, named the Tracker, was an odd vessel because it was never near any system or planet. It was always bouncing around no man's land outside of hyperspace lanes. The intention was to intercept communication inside all of those lanes or, overall, avoid interaction with the Separatists. Regardless, now that all of Clone Force 99 was on the same page, they made their landing procedure. They were able to call one of the winged hangar bays their home, and from there they started their trek through the halls of the facility. Hunter and Tech took point, with Wrecker keeping an eye on their six. Crosshair left many beacons around so that they could use their angles to take out whatever was inside this ship. The first few minutes of their arrival was pretty uneventful. They didn't see any enemy or Delta. As they ascended the shutdown elevator shaft to the main bridge, they found their squad. Fixer and Boss were on edge, but they immediately recognized that this wasn't any normal group of troopers. As they made some quick introductions, Scorch from the supply closet down the hall exclaimed that they weren't expecting special forces. Crosshair was the clone he was next to when he said that. Scorch popped his shoulder to get a brotherly reaction, and the experimental clone just stared at him. Tech cut in, explaining the situation with Crosshair, which Scorch didn't really mind. Those squads would be fully within the bridge as Sev was doing some of his own recon on the other bridge, which was just as empty. Neither unit saw any sign of anything. They were just wandering around, looking for something that killed this crew. Boss explained that they had heard movement, but there was nothing else aside from that. Wrecker acknowledged that the regs didn't have blaster marks or anything. It was very weird. Fixer made a comment on their broken appendages, something that Tech had also noticed, but Wrecker didn't hear it when Tech said it to the crew earlier. Wrecker must have just assumed it was more tech babble. Well, their mission was to retrieve the information from the database, and as it turns out, no one had taken that either, so Fixer and Tech got to work, as the rest of the two squads came up with a plan. Boss and Hunter decided that they would merge their groups into one. Sev, Crosshair, and Scorch would examine the reactor room. Wrecker would stay here with Tech and Fixer. Hunter and Boss would go to the medical bay to see if this was some sort of disease. Wrecker wasn't the most excited, but they split up and got to work. As they moved throughout the ship, both squads continued to hear movement, but see nothing. The squad with Scorch was exciting. Sev and Crosshair were silent people, but Scorch liked to try and break Sev's balls, so he was attempting to wind up Crosshair too. Luckily for Crosshair, he had Wrecker as his tube roommate. He was already used to it, but the sly, sarcastic, and even devious remarks that Crosshair gave Scorch in response only encouraged the other clone commando to be more ballistic with his verbal outbursts. Boss and Hunter, on the other hand, were getting along great. They moved into the medical bay, and Hunter diagnosed that nothing had been here. There wasn't even a member of their crew on sickbay. It was just empty. No one had a cold, an illness, not even a headache. It was completely vacated when they entered, and this left them with even more questions. Even weirder, there hadn't been a single case of this crew facing illness throughout their entire voyage since about a half a year beforehand. It continued getting even more bizarre. Fixer attempted to check the security cameras, but all the footage had been wiped. But up in the main bridge, where the three were, they cracked the code. They were able to break open the communication code and dig into it to get what they came for. As they pulled the data cards out, revealing every piece of sealed information from the tracker's half a year of operation, the ceiling opened. The three elite troopers didn't hear or see it as they started to siphon through the data cards to try and find the most recent one. Just as they did, Wrecker yelped, tossing his body back and forth before jumping on his own back and hearing a massive crunch. The assassins from the ceiling dropped down and moved to attack the clones. This was an elite group, one that didn't use regular weapons. The reason the clones showed no signs of blaster damage is because these assassins either snapped their necks or used lightsaber-like daggers to slit throats. They didn't need to use regular weapons because of how effective they were. When they boarded, the tracker got hit by a man-made meteor shower. It didn't do terrible damage to the ship, but the damage it did do was how these assassins entered the vessel. Wrecker elbowed the individual who couldn't move anyways, and he turned around firing into the backs of the other assassins, who tried to drop in on Tech and Scorch. The two commandos were able to duck or slide out of the way to avoid death. The last assassin, crushed by Wrecker's big backside, tried to scramble away. The clones demanded information but got none, so he was killed. The clones radioed out to their squads, informing them of the situation. Boss and Hunter, though, were already in the middle of their own scrum. The assassins tried to gut them as they left the medical bay, and they were engaged in fist-to-fist combat. The assassins thrived in close-quarter space. Against regs, they were pretty much unstoppable, but elite clone troopers were a totally different story. Boss used his wrist blade to stab the chest of one of these assassins, while using his own hand to stop another, headbutting them off of their feet. Hunter had a massive vibroblade, which was semi-broken because he clashed with one of their daggers. It, like a lightsaber would, cut through his dagger. Not all the way, not destroyed it, but enough that he could warn Boss about it. Hunter dragged the shiv into the stomach of one of the assassins, before blasting the next in the face with his pistol. Hunter and Boss were able to regroup, back to back, as four more came in to confront them. Even though these squads had no prior interaction with each other, both clones knew that they could trust the other. They were brothers, and for an experimental clone like Hunter, that was a rewarding feeling. The regs weren't so generous in their thoughts or words to Clone Force 99. They pieced off and started fighting their opponents. Hunter was able to use one of the assassins' bodies as a shield, and use his broken shiv to kill the next. Boss's work on the other two assassins was just as seamless. They would contact their allies about these knives, as Hunter suggested that they get out of here. Boss agreed. The Marauder was close, but Delta's vessel was docked at the bow of the tracker. It wouldn't be worth risking their lives to get there. The mission was a success. They just needed to get out. As they made their move, Hunter grabbed one of the weapons so that he could examine it or use it. The three clone groups moved through the Venator, avoiding assassins as they did. There were at least 50 of them on the ship. Well, luckily for the clones, they shouldn't be seeing them again. Hunter and Boss were able to use their positions by the Marauder as a firing line, where they picked off assassins that were chasing their brothers. Tech, Fixer, and Wrecker were the first group back, with Scorch, Sev, and Crosshair moving right behind them. They didn't see any assassins until they turned the final corner into the corridor that led to the hangar bay, and Crosshair, in an effort to prove his effectiveness, fired one round and took out 4 assassins in one shot. You couldn't see it, with the helmets on at least, but Scorch's mouth hung open in reaction. Sev loved it, and had the utmost desire to prove himself a better sharpshooter the next they saw each other. The clones ferried into the Marauder, and as they did, the tracker's engines kicked on, and the entire starship came to life. It became clear what the motive was. These assassins were hired to kill the crew inside the ship and get the information. When they couldn't break the firewall protecting the information, they waited. Now, if they couldn't have it, no one could. However, Tech and Fixer came up with an alternative idea after they killed their first few attackers. As the Marauder escaped, the Venator exploded, splitting up into dozens of pieces and detonating into a blaze of glory. Their mission was in essence a success. Those squads were going to Coruscant anyways, so might as well just use the Marauder to get there. Their mission debriefing with Command wouldn't go over super well. The Republic wanted to continue using the tracker, or at least reuse it, and because the officers, upset, weren't there in person, they wished to punish the troopers for their faulty decision-making. But because they couldn't openly court-martial a commando operation, they needed to bring in higher authorities. Inevitably, both squads would be kept on Coruscant for 3 weeks, waiting to get out of the situation. It wouldn't be until a clone operator decided to try and cut them out that they actually got their bail. Because the officer tried to group up Delta and Clone Force 99 into one group, due to facing the same charges and keep the paperwork easier, they were listed under a title called Rejects. The 8 clones rather liked that title, so it stuck. Once they were broken out, the Republic officer who tried to harm their reputation was stripped of his titles and thrown in prison, while the Reject Squad was sent back out into action. Because this was a clone trooper saving other clones, this combined unit needed to prove themselves. To higher up Republic leadership, they didn't care about the logistics of what squad did what action. In their eyes, this is what the clones were referred to as, Rejects. Instead of being punished though, they'd have their chance to fight for their right to continue serving the Republic. Their next mission would consist of going deep into Separatist territory to pull information for their war effort. If they could successfully pull it off, then they would likely have all charges dropped and forgotten. This was something that would likely make it to the Chancellor's desk. Well, this mission would be more imperative for something much more important than just that information. During their op, they had a slight run-in with Ventress. Now, she was not thrilled to see clones behind enemy lines. While she would have no issue dispatching most squads, the snipers, Crosshair and Sev, were able to save their squad mates in this scenario. The entire operation took place in a valley, so the other 6 clones were gathering the information, with 2 lookouts making sure they didn't get killed. When conflict started, Crosshair and Sev started a competition. Ironically, the personality of Clone Wick made someone like Crosshair a little more open. The competitiveness between sharpshooters made them bond especially well, not to mention that they were both absolute maniacs. They fired round after round into the base, battle droids dropped, and Ventress, who used the Force to throw Wrecker into the other clones and nearly kill Scorch, was pushed back. Their suppressing fire made Ventress retreat into cover before a canister of fuel was hit and she was separated from the clones. Sev had less kills than Crosshair, therefore he had to go and get the Marauder ready. But next time, he promised his brother, he would be the better shooter in their game. Crosshair loved the challenge, but he also reciprocated the promise because he would never lose to a reg. Anyways, this little incident made Sidious even less favorable of Ventress, and it put these clones on her radar and his. They returned to Coruscant to receive accolades from Republic High Command. They would be sent out to do more missions, as Delta and Clone Force 99 accepted their combined title of Reject Squad. It was like a call sign. Delta didn't really have a logo, at least not one as definitive as the Bad Batch, so they used some of their artistic talent and created new logos for themselves, and their squad became like brothers. Aside from the obvious, the fact that they were all brothers, Delta Squad adopted a more human connection with Clone Force 99. It was very uncommon for the regs to see the experimental unit in this light. Most clone troopers believed that they were truly rejects. The Bad Batch wasn't good enough to be a regular clone, which is why they got their enhancements. They weren't special because they were rejects. Once Delta got thrown in with Reject Squad, They were also associated by the regs as rejected specimens. Before any of their trouble on Coruscant with the officer and during their mission on the tracker, Boss, Scorch, Fixer, and Sev only saw the Bad Batch as their brothers. They were all able to unify themselves more concretely because there was never anything dividing them. No preconceived notions of disgust or distrust. These were their brothers. A little unique, yeah. A little different, sure. But clones nonetheless. Reject Squad may have not been favored by the other clones, but these were 8 of the most elite and most successful clones in the entire Grand Army of the Republic. Their duty was to each other, the clones who despised them, and the Republic which was so clearly in peril. This united front gave the clones a chance to succeed, where other clone commando units or elite squads might fail. Several more months would pass by, with Reject Squad remaining a top respected unit in the clone army. They were constantly successful, and almost unstoppable in all of their missions. They didn't really stop moving either. Due to the sheer size of their group, they were expected to pick up and keep going. Every other commando unit was 4 or 5 deep, but the rejects were 8 deep. Kinda funny how they were all rejects, but they were needed all the time. Well, anyways, despite their constant success, they were called upon once again, but not from a source they expected to hear from. This wasn't a breach of communication, this was a full-blown stalker situation, potentially Dahmer. The clones were finishing up their work at a CIS communications station, and they were approached by Ventress. Without having their high ground or anywhere to keep themselves safe at, they were assured death, but it didn't come. Instead, the clones were approached by the former assassin, and she told them that she had a mission for them. The clones were confused beyond belief, something that had them raising their weapons at someone not known for her patient skills. Ventress told the clones that they could both profit from this, and if they did, then it was worth their time. Wrecker chimed in, telling her that they don't work for the Separatists. She told the big lad to quiet down before he pulls a blood vessel. Ventress explained that she wanted to kill Count Dooku because he had betrayed her. The clones looked to each other, clearly not knowing about her little traumatic experience. She was getting together a group of witches to kill him in his sleep, and truthfully, she didn't believe it would be enough. But if the squad that almost killed her could do that, then they could also be perfect additions to this. They asked what the catch was, and she shrugged her shoulders. No catch. She respected them, in the very slightest, because they held their own against her, despite their clear advantage, but she still respected them. No other clone had done that, or survived, so she was giving them a chance to become heroes. She let them discuss before they agreed, which meant that they'd be extending their current mission as to not draw suspicion from the leadership. The clones piled into the Marauder and followed Asajj to Dathomir. Were there thoughts or questions of safety? Absolutely. But this merry band of brothers knew that it was worth the risk of their lives to kill Dooku. It wasn't within their pay grade, they didn't get paid anyways, but it was an honorable mission in their eyes, something that could redirect the course of this war and hopefully bring it to an end. At Dathomir, they regrouped with 2 other sisters, and they briefly interacted with Mother Talzin. She was certainly a character, someone that frightened all of them, just a little. She was a menacing individual, but they carried on and set coordinates for Sereno. The clones were ready for this mission, and they had a couple strategies that they told Ventress about. Some she liked, others she wasn't as thrilled about. Asajj wasn't exactly the nicest person to be around. She loved to mess people up, mostly verbally. The other Night Sisters weren't much for conversation either. When they landed, it was dark, and the Marauder, piloted by Tech, lifted off again. The Night Sisters went undercover. Being that they were completely invisible, this was their chance. The commandos had to sneak around guards manually, but they were able to almost keep pace with the Night Sisters. They broke through the side entrance and followed Asajj as they entered the Count's bedroom. Asajj looked to the right and noticed that the clones were listening to her plan. Dooku was awoken from his slumber in a dazed confusion, and his lightsaber found its way to his hand. The Night Sisters used their own weapons to appear as Jedi, and Ventress led the assault. When the clones entered the bedroom, they backed away. It was a little too close quarter for them to be any assistance, so they took positions around the main chamber of the castle. As the Night Sisters fought with Dooku, he was able to aggressively beat them back, using his mastery of lightsaber techniques to deter their assassination attempts. As they entered the main chambers of the castle, the clones fired down on them, just as was ordered by Ventress. It was their backup plan. and now it was coming to fruition. The Count defended himself, swinging his lightsaber between his body and his face, deflecting shots back at the clones. Scorch did slip away from his own blaster bolt, returning to him. Boss and Hunter pushed Fixer back as lightsabers continued to collide. Just as the clones were taking more defensive positions, the sentries activated. But that wouldn't be a problem. Tech had the Marauder in position, and the glass windows shattered with a single shot. Dooku, still dazed, turned in confusion, before dropping away and stabbing a Night Sister in the chest. He was then attacked by Ventress as both Sev and Crosshair stood on the ramp of the Marauder and fired everything they had down into the castle. Magna Guards were dropped almost immediately, as the rest of the rejects tried to destroy Dooku. A droid popper blew up at his feet and he buzzed in electrocution, before trying to stab Ventress again. A blaster shot rang out through his shoulder, forcing him to drop his lightsaber. His former pupil swung, but he used his hands to bat her away, with the other Night Sister swinging in. Dooku used Ventress's own saber to kill her sister, before Sev lined up the right shot and fired it straight through Dooku's head, and he dropped. He turned to Crosshair and told him that counted for 10, and his brother smiled at him, pushing him up the ramp as Tech rolled back around with the ship so they could pick up the brothers and Ventress. Unluckily for the clones, they were now involved in something deeper. They wouldn't get all the information they needed on the war from Dooku's desk, but they learned a lot of unnerving details about the Clone War. Jango Fett's name and payroll was still on there, meaning that Dooku was the man who commissioned the clone army in some fashion. There were some other details, but there was a more important lesson for them to gain. Lust for revenge can never be satisfied. Ventress was thrilled with Dooku's death, but she wanted more. If Tyrannus was a villain in her life, then so was his master, who surely requested that the order to have her killed be fulfilled. Dooku may have challenged it or accepted it readily, but Ventress didn't believe that Tyrannus was solely responsible for these actions. She told the clones and Mother Talzin that she wanted revenge, and she wanted it finished. The clones truthfully didn't want to be here. They were stuck on Dathomir because Ventress was standing in the way. They were worried that Talzin might have them killed too, but Talzin assured them that they needn't worry. She promised them safety and security under her protection, because they had honored one of her Night Sisters. This was something that earned her respect, so they were fine in Talzin's eyes. As for Sidious though, that was a different problem. Mother Talzin knew Palpatine on a first-name basis. She knew what and who he was. The master manipulator and vengeful soul wouldn't rest easy in the coming days if he found out that the Night Sisters were responsible. And despite them covering up their tracks really well, they were not completely impervious to threats from Palpatine. Sidious was a very intelligent Sith Lord, and it made Talzin almost regret siding with Ventress in this movement. However, she also recognized that she lost Maul, her son, because of Palpatine. Maul was suffering due to his failure to teach him, and the Jedi would never step foot on Dathomir with impure intentions. They weren't a religious sect to worry about. The Sith were. And if Palpatine didn't make a move on the Night Sister during the Clone War, if he won, then he would without a doubt remove any threat to his power even without provocation. And if he won the war, that meant them. In her regret over killing Dooku out of worry for her clan, she found resolution. Talzin told the others that she would consult old Daka over this and return with an answer. This left 8 clones and Asajj Ventress alone. The clones were still a little on edge, but they had a very nice and open discussion with Ventress during their waiting. She wasn't the most open person ever, but she showed some humanity right here, because they had helped her with getting her revenge. She spoke about the Sith, in an attempt to fill them in on the information that may have not fully clicked for them, which in all fairness was most of what they were talking about. The clones actually enjoyed this side of Ventress, but it wouldn't last forever, because she'd be given a very important antidote. Similar to the poison they gave to Dooku, they would give this to Palpatine. Talzin showed on a green orb that Sidious and Palpatine were one and the same. Asajj and the clones were fighting a pointless war. More than Ventress, the clones wanted their own revenge because their brothers were dying pointlessly. The galaxy in the coming hours would learn of Dooku's death. It was time for the Sith to die together. Ventress's mission was very important. She would be cloaking herself, this time using a technique that Talzin would show her, and when the Jedi were in session with the Chancellor, she would poison him. Old Daka and Talzin concocted a potion that would reveal the true identity of an individual. It was a specifically created potion for Palpatine, so Ventress better not waste it. They departed immediately for Coruscant. The clones themselves revealed how they felt. They were mortified, betrayed, and even angry. Asajj could sympathize with them in this, because she had experienced this from Dooku. But their entire lives were a lie. They were bred for a war that had only one winner, and so she promised them that she would assist in Palpatine's death for all of their brothers. She gave the clones a sense of peace and also trust in Ventress. Asajj was doing this more or less to keep the trust between them, but she also did believe it in some way. When they arrived on Coruscant, they would land at the executive building. A Jedi transport was at the landing docks, and Ventress went to work. As was prepared, she cloaked herself and took the poison into Palpatine's office. It was kind of funny. She jabbed the poison into his neck, and he rose from the chair swinging his arms. Confusion and frustration washed over him, and as if a switch had been flipped, Palpatine became Sidious. His eyes shared a yellow glow. His skin became shriveled and poisoned. He looked like a Sith of old, and the desk before him broke with a swing of his hand. The Jedi jumped up to their feet, as a few clones and senators with them watched in horror. Palpatine damned whoever did this to him, and tried to blame someone, but confusion kept him tripping, and the Force was crushing different pieces of furniture around him at his will. The Jedi acted immediately. Sidious tried to raise a weapon to fight, but as he pulled a lightsaber, it was cut in half, and so was Palpatine. The senators, clones, and Jedi took their steps back and tried to understand what had just happened. Their initial thoughts were that Palpatine was in danger, and that a changer had taken over his position to cause a rupture in the Senate. The idea being that Dooku's death was faked, and that a Separatist changer, disguised as Palpatine, was going to elongate the war. But no, they couldn't find any proof that the individual was anything other than Palpatine himself. But this was not the end of the Clone War. It was the end of the manufactured conflict started by the Sith. Without them around, and several peace treaty attempts failing before this ever happened, there was little room for error on both sides. After the Coruscant power grid was bombed earlier in the war, the Senate became even more harsh in their rhetoric. They demanded that 5 million more clones be created, but there was no sign of such creation fully getting into action at this point. It would take 10 years if they went the same route as before, but the war looked as though it might not end. Regardless, the point is, the Senate was not inclined to take peace offers from the Separatists, and the CIS was hesitant about siding with the Republic too. The death of Mina Bontiri was a true deal-breaker. Onderon had a powerful position within the Confederacy. Without her voice, they were left without strength in the absence of Dooku. The CIS Council, led by Nute Gunray, would assume control and command over the Confederacy in a hostile takeover. Despite being a coward through and through, Nute Gunray understood what needed to be done here. Without Dooku, the CIS would fall to the Council or to Grievous, and Gunray chose himself as the future tyrant of their system. The other Separatist leaders were a bit hesitant, but if Grievous killed Gunray, then they could all get along. Nute was a sacrifice that they were willing to make, but Grievous was on the front lines. He couldn't retreat back to the capital to stop political squabbles he understood so little about. Tyrannus kept him as uninformed as possible, and it paid off in the favor of the CIS Council because they had no true threat. Admiral Trench was a fair shot, but he wasn't interested in political leadership. He just wanted to maintain his militaristic leverage, which Gunray and his allies were happy to accommodate for him. The war found a new sense of life with the death of the Sith, and because Asajj got her revenge, she was no longer interested in the conflict. The rejects even asked that she help them, but she was under the belief that by killing Dooku and Sidious, they had made themselves even. It was up to them and their armies to finish this off. The fight was no longer between her and some other Force adept. The Night Sisters were completely safe from the CIS Council because they weren't even on the radar. They didn't have enough population for slave labor on Dathomir. They didn't have the materials necessary for harvesting, and their position was too awkward for any real trading outpost. So Dathomir was completely safe. Ventress, Towson, and Old Daka had done their part. From now on, the fight would be their own. The rejects, as per request of High Command, were sent back into action. They were heroes for a moment, but no one knew. It actually shredded their morale, not because they wanted to be heroes and weren't recognized, but because they were still fighting a basically pointless war. This was now the oligarchs versus the galaxy. The Republic was working to remove power from the Federation and their allies, but their nails were so deep into the system that it would take decades of work to undo. So, the CIS was able to continue fighting the war, despite losing some semi-valuable representation inside the Galactic Senate, and losing their own government, and losing Dooku. They had a military. Masameda rose to power with a demanding presence that requested that regular citizens join their fight. No longer could they just depend on the clone army. With the reserve military being activated from Coruscant, it was up to the dozens of commando squads across the galaxy to get the job done. Ironically, the rejects would not have a position of involvement here. That would go to Omega Squad. They found Mustafar because that was their quadrant of the galaxy that they were working out of. However, that did not mean the end of the war. It was simply a percentage of the CIS military. Omega Squad was basically able to shut down a small percentage of the CIS military. The Council knew that they'd be in trouble if everything went through and out of Mustafar, so they changed their operating system. Jedi warriors started to work with commandos to find other depots of control, but they were still impossible to find. Mustafar was by happenstance, and this is where the rejects came in at. The third year of conflict had just begun. The Republic was back to losing, despite raising a civilian fighting force of over 3 million militiamen and women. The clones were still the frontline troopers of the Republic, but now there were an assortment of other freedom fighters to take the load off the clones. Reject Squad, on the other hand, continued building their bond with each other through a series of missions deep into Separatist territory. They were able to disable a Foundry or two, but their success was killing off Wat Tambor at Skako Minor. It was a useful victory, but still Nute Gunray existed out beyond their reach, somewhere in the galaxy where they could not find him. But the rejects, despite following Republic orders, had to disobey them for a shot at victory. Thanks to putting a hit out on Tambor, they intercepted a communication from some bankers at Scipio that were awaiting Gunray and the Council's arrival. They planned to put the entire Republic into economic debt by raising interest rates by 200% plus. In this, they could bankrupt the Republic and force it into a recession or maybe even a depression. The clones didn't know that, and they didn't need to. Their sole goal was taking out Gunray and the other leaders of the Council. As they departed into hyperspace, they knew this was a chance that it could be their final mission together. It would be the fight to end the Clone War, but it could also kill them all. No one knew what the banking clans had protecting them. The clones would share some deep sentiments with one another. They were all proud to be brothers and thanked each of themselves for the journey of a lifetime. This was their chance to make the war end. When they exited hyperspace, they crossed paths with a Separatist fleet, using a frequency stolen from Omega Squad at Mustafar. They were able to breeze by the Separatist fleet and make their landing approach on the surface. They cruised through the atmosphere and landed on the rear docking yards of the facility. There were some battle droids that greeted them, assuming that they were a part of the banking clan crew. But no, a few physical takedowns and droids were pulled out of the way. Hunter pointed up the mountain and told Boss that he would take Fixer, Sev, and Crosshair. Boss nodded, with Tech, Scorch, and Wrecker following him into the facility. They were going to make two movements, hopefully one through the upper layer of the building and the other through the bottom, because this was an all-in mission to kill one guy. Boss started in heavy, with explosions everywhere. The 4 clones bursted through the doors and fired at security droids in the way. The other 4 clones could hear the firefight starting and moved to climb faster. Inside the peak, Nute Gunray and the other Separatist conspirators got to work to crash the Republic market. They had to move fast, and as the bankers got to work, Separatist troop transports landed on the surface to detain the clones. Luckily for the rejects, they had the element of the interior hallways to their advantage. Wrecker and Scorch lobbed explosives down the halls, and once they got to the main entrance, they laid everything into the incoming battle droids. This gave them a slight perimeter to work with here, because all of the droids were under the direction of Nute Gunray. As he waited impatiently at the peak of the tower, the glass behind them broke, but it was a bit too late. The banking clans issued its formal letter to the Republic, informing them of the credit changes that would spike interest rates by 400%, because Gunray thought it'd be funny. Panic set in across the Republic, as the rest of the rejects slaughtered the banking clan leaders. Gunray panicked, trying to squeeze his way out of it, but Sev rolled his dagger along his throat and told him to rot. The kid and Nemodian man would bleed out on the ground, with nothing and no one around him. The clones, though, were not out of this. They, from their position, would fire down at the incoming battle droids, while Hunter and Fixer fired at the HMP gunships. The fight was brutal, and eventually the clones at the top of the tower were forced to retreat into the structure when it got bombed. In the lower corridors, Tech, Boss, Scorch, and Wrecker held themselves behind some debris from destroyed halls, thanks to their earlier explosions. With super battle droids marching towards them, they had very little room for error. As they were fighting, a rocket dispersed their group, sending Scorch and Wrecker to the ground, and Tech with Boss into the other hall. The battle droids didn't stop moving towards them. As things got more and more grim, the rest of the rejects arrived, confirming the job done. The clones turned to retreat, and as they did, they were confronted with another group of droids. Blasters raged in terror on all sides, brothers shoving each other away from danger, while others launched explosives into the directions of the battle droids. Boss told the men to move, and they started as Scorch was grabbed up by a B-2 battle droid, and Wrecker leveled his shoulder into the droid, crushing it to pieces before he was shot in the chest by another. Wrecker stopped in his tracks as Scorch fell to his feet and fired right in the face of the next B-2. The massive clone stumbled and fell to the ground before another cycle of shots were blown into his back. Scorch cried out, but Crosshair pulled him back, telling him it was too late, before firing another shot into the droids. Hunter pushed his men back, getting behind all of them, being the last leg of defense for the squad of rejects. As the men kept running through the halls, leaving behind their poor Wrecker, an explosion rocked the landing platform they were running towards. The Marauder, in an explosive fray, ricocheted debris towards the structure, indenting the door and causing it to malfunction and slam shut. The clones were now trapped. They had no way to escape, and now they couldn't even get up to the landing platform. So, they set up a defensive ground. Ramparts were compiled quickly, and another commando was shot down. Fixer was domed by a commando droid, which didn't kill him. It was the vibroblade through his stomach that finished him off. The other commandos reacted, firing and destroying the droid as Fixer fell lifeless next to them. The clones knew he was gone, and they hunkered down for their final stand. Scorch got as many explosives as he could and handed them to his brothers, as they threw them over their shoulders. B-2s continued leading the charge, with the seemingly impossible-to-kill commando droids still coming down adjacent halls. It was a hopeless fight, but they were going to keep going until each of them had their last breaths. Tech was launched from his feet next. A shot cratered through his glasses and obliterated his eye, but he was still alive. Boss got up, knowing it would be suicide to do it, and he grabbed Tech by the shoulder and pulled him into the barricade, as shots crushed through his backpack, but he was mostly uninjured. As the clones fired back, something changed. The droids were distracted. A great light appeared and explosions rippled out from the main landing bay. The droids turned around, giving the commandos a chance to fire into their backs, but they were no longer the main threat. Sev got back into his brother Tech immediately, as the other commandos watched a battle ensue at the front of the lines. Men in orange uniforms appeared from nowhere, dropping from the skies, led by a bearded Jedi Master. The 212th and the 7th Sky Corps were here. A space battle raged overhead, with clones dominating the ground below. Obi-Wan sliced through the droids, pushing them with the Force and clobbering them with his saber. He watched the commandos rise with a sense of joy before they started firing again. The 212th spread out as Commander Cody decked a B-2, and his brother-in-arms, Obi-Wan, dispersed a haul of them with the wave of his hand. He looked to the commandos and made sure they were alright, as his men fanned out, away from their location. The question of how came up with the other clones, and Kenobi lightheartedly told them that after their mission to the communication base, the one where they were supposed to come back but Dooku was killed, well, Republic High Command decided to track the Marauder. In fear that the Bad Batch and Delta Squad were starting a conflict with the banking clans, they prepared to stop them, until the Republic realized that a fleet was already here, and that these guys, the commandos, were already ahead of the curve. Kenobi's troops were the closest in the area, and that's how they got here so quickly. Obi-Wan did apologize for the loss of their brothers, but he did offer some condolence. Their sacrifices may have just ended the war. Tech and Boss would be taken by medics to get patched up, as the other survivors brought their lifeless brothers out so they could be taken to a proper burial site, despite the harshness of the fact that they weren't fully trusted. Kenobi would be right. The Clone War came to an end within weeks of the Battle of Scipio. Republic fighters crippled the Separatist morale, and with commando units taking out leaders of the CIS Council, it slowly fell apart. Obi-Wan and his former student would be responsible for Grievous's destruction during these few weeks at Megiddo. It would be a harrowing fight, but one not possible without the sacrifices of the rejects. The survivors of the squad would be recognized by both the Republic and the Jedi Order for their work. Wrecker and Fixer would be properly memorialized, but despite not getting their recognition for helping defeat the Sith in the public eye, the rejects were the heroes of the war. The truth would be learned about Ventress's involvement, and the Jedi would go to Dathomir to try and make amends with them in some fashion. It would be a whole thing, but in the end, they would create an alliance, and the Jedi would make arrangements to take care of whatever Ventress needed from here on out. Boss, Hunter, Tech, Scorch, Sev, and Crosshair would remain a squad even after the Battle of Scipio. There were rebels that needed to be dealt with, and their camaraderie would shine through these skirmishes, sometimes with droids, other times with people. After it was all finished though, when they returned to Coruscant with a true hero's welcome, they would learn that thanks to senators like Amidala, Organa, and Chuchi, and the approval from interim Chancellor Ameda, they would have the ability to retire and live out lives as Republic heroes. A clone district was being created on Coruscant, Naboo, Alderaan, Chandrilia, and Pantora, just for starters. Of course, the boys of Reject Squad would stick together here and remain on Coruscant. Their lives after the war wouldn't shift that much, for their squad dynamic at least. Tech would become a great innovator of Republic technology. Boss and Hunter started up a sushi shop in the financial district, as Crosshair, Sev, and Scorch would set up the Star Wars version of Topgolf. It would be very popular, and yeah, it was Scorch's idea. He busted both Sev and Crosshair up so much that they told him that they would create it just in spite, to basically prove Scorch that they could do it. They didn't realize that Scorch just wanted the free drinks. But it became very popular. They also would reunite with Ventress a couple of times, which was semi-euphoric. She eventually came around to joining them at pool halls on Coruscant. The rejects would live out the rest of their lives in peace and tranquility. They would tell harrowing stories of their squad to the public, and for generations they would be remembered as heroes of a war that many wished to never repeat again. And that, my friends, is our story. Again, special thanks to the patrons for supporting the channel. Smash that like button. Let's talk about the story. Also, giveaway down below, giving away 2 Venators. Not a big deal at all. 150,000 subscribers. Oh my god, that's crazy. Go check it out. You get a free Venator. Also, I will announce it in a video. If you see something, it is a scammer. They are a plague on the earth. If someone's trying to DM you, they are a scammer. Do not trust them. I don't do that. Anyways, let's talk about this story. So, this was a lot of fun. I know we did the Anakin and Delta last week. I was really looking to do a clone-based story, and I didn't really get to do that with the Delta one last week, and I was longing for something like that, and that's where this story comes in, honestly. This was a ton of fun. I had so much fun with this. There were 2 really hard kills at the end. I really like both squads. I actually really adore. I think both are really just great squads of clones, and it was really hard to kill off anybody, but I feel like Delta Squad would be very empathetic, very understanding of the Bad Batch. I don't think they'd be like, hey, you guys are rejects, you guys should be treated like dirt. No, I think Delta would be like, yo, you're our brothers. But I think Delta and Bad Batch would get along really great and almost like generationally. I think they would just enjoy being around each other, and I think they would thrive as a result. Mostly I wanted to show off the camaraderie between brothers here. That is the big thing I was going for. And then I also thought it would be fun to kind of pair up the Bad Batch and Delta Squad with Ventress. I feel like that's just kind of like a weird dynamic, but I think it worked out really well in the story. And of course, you get the happy ending, so it's pretty cool. You know, it is in memory of the fallen comrades, but I hope you all enjoyed. I love you all, spread the love, and always remember, my friends, may the Force be with you.